The Círoבין Perek Tes Mishnah Aleph. Kol gagos se'ir reshus achas uvilvad shlo yehei gag gavoya asora oino mechasora. The Chachamim answered carrying between a house and a chotzer without an eruv because it resembles carrying from reshus yochad to reshus rabim. The two nekudas that make the house appear like a different reshus from the chotzer. Number one, the house is owned by one person or family, while the chotzer is also owned by others. Number two, the house is used regularly by its occupants, while the chotzer is used by others, which makes the nafkamina in the ownerships very obvious. So the Mishnah discusses the halach of carrying between reshus hayochids that are owned by different people but are not used regularly. L'mashal, kol gagos se'ir reshus achas. All the rooftops of the city. The Rashi speaks out in the Gemara that the rooftops in the times of the Mishnah were flat and were usable. So obviously they weren't made out of straw because otherwise it wouldn't be usable. So all the rooftops of a city are considered one reshus, even though the houses beneath them are occupied by different residents. Since the rooftops themselves are not used regularly, they're not considered separate reshus from one another. That is, even though the rooftops belong to the houses beneath them, and the houses are considered separate from one another, all the rooftops are considered as one reshus. One may therefore carry from one rooftop to another even without an eruv. As long as one rooftop is not 10 tvachim higher or 10 tvachim lower than the other rooftop. If they are higher or lower, there's a special Isud Rabbanon against carrying between them. Zivri Reb Meir, Azay Zok Reb Meir. The Chachamim argue, and the Chachamim say, Kol echad ve'echad reshus b'fnei atzmai. Each rooftop is a separate reshus because they are treated the same as the houses beneath them. Therefore, just as we may not carry from one house to another without an eruv, so too we may not carry from one rooftop to another unless there's an eruv between the houses. Reb Shimon says a kula, mekel mikulan. Echad gagas echad chatzeres echad karfeifes reshus achas lekelim sheshavsu leseicham. Reb Shimon says rooftops, courtyards, and karfeifes, which are large enclosures that are not used as living space. The Mishnah refers to a karfef with an area that's no more than 100 by 50 amas. A larger karfef has the status of a carmelis, so one may not carry from it to any reshus yachid or vice versa, like we spoke in Perek Beis. So Reb Shimon says they're all considered one reshus because they're not used regularly, and one may carry from one to the other even without eruv. In regard to which type of stuff, in regard to what? With regard to utensils that began Shabbos inside one of these areas. But now with regard to kelim that began Shabbos in the house, what are we talking about? What does this mean? Now there is a mitzvah of shvisas kelim, as we spoke in Perek Aleph and Shabbos. So if a utensil is on the roof or a chotzer when Shabbos began, it may be carried to any of these other outdoor enclosures. However, if it began Shabbos in the house and was then taken out to one of these outdoor enclosures, even in a way that's mutter, one may not carry that item to another outdoor enclosure unless there's an eruv between the house and the second enclosure. Mishnah Beis. Ga godel samach lakoton, ha godel mutter vakoton aser. When an area in which it's mutter to carry is open to an area in which it's aser to carry, and there's no mechita between them, the forbidden area causes the area hamutaras to be aser as well. We explained this earlier in the Masechta. Moreover, even if two reshuyos, which are mutter to carry, are open to each other, but it's forbidden to carry from one to another, it's also to carry between these two reshuyos, even within these actual areas themselves, as we mentioned in Perek Zayin. So over here the Mishnah will discuss two cases where one reshus hayochid is completely open to another, but only one of them is aser. It begins with the case of two neighboring rooftops where the houses are not joined by an eruv. Ga godel samach lekoton. If there's a large rooftop next to a small rooftop with no eruv joining them and no wall separating them, and the large rooftop overlaps the small one on both sides, hagodl mutter, carrying in the large rooftop is permitted, because the places where the large rooftop juts out on either side of the small one creates a valid mechitza for the larger roof. V'hakotan aser, but carrying on the small rooftop is aser because it overlaps. The overlaps are not considered a mechitza for the small rooftop. Therefore, the small rooftop is considered completely open to the large one. And since the rooftops are not joined together by an eruv, carrying on the small rooftop is aser. The Mishnah continues, a similar case of two neighboring chatzeros with no eruv between them. We sort of spoke about this earlier in Perek Zayin as well. There's a large chatzer that was breached, that the wall collapsed, so now it opens into a neighboring smaller chatzer, and the large chutzner overlaps the small chutzner on both sides of the pirza. So Gedola Muteres, carrying in the large chutzner is mutter, Uktan Asura, but carrying in the small chutzner is Asur, because the pirza, the breach, is like the entranceway of the large chutzner. So the large chutzner has a valid mechitza that separates it from the small one, and one may therefore carry in the large chutzner. The small chutzner, however, has no mechitza separating it from the large one. Therefore, just as one may not carry between the large chutzner and the small chutzner, so too it is forbidden to carry in the small chutzner by itself. Chutzner shenivertel reshus harabim. Now, the Mishnah continues with the case of a chutzner bordering a reshus harabim with no mechitza between them. As mentioned before, the Chachamim after carrying in such a chutzner. The Mishnah will now address the din d'oraisa of the area where the wall once stood. So chutzner shenivertel reshus harabim. If there was a chutzner that was breach that had a pirza in it, so now it's open to Rishus Harabim. Hamachnas mitaychel Rishus Hayochid, one who carries from the place of the breach, from the pirza, from the place where the wall once stood to a Rishus Hayochid, Omer Rishus Hayochid Lusaycha, or from Rishus Hayochid to that place, he's chayiv to Isur Deraisa. He's chayiv for being over on the malacha of being mavim Rishus LaRishus. This is because the place where the wall once stood is now considered a Rishus Harabim. Divrei Rebbe Lezer. Say like Rebbe Lezer. Chachamim the Chachamim argue, and the Chachamim say, "Miteichel Rishus Harabim, Rishus Harabim l'Toicha, part of Mepnei Shu Karmelis." The Chachamim say the one who carries from inside the Chatzar to the Rishus Harabim, or from the Rishus Harabim into the Chatzar, he was not over on any Isur Deraisa. He's Potter. Mepnei Shu Karmelis, because the Chatzar is like a Karmelis and not a Rishus Hayochid. But at the same token, the Chachamim argue that the place where the wall once stood should also be considered a Karmelis and not a Rishus Harabim. Someone who carries between the place of the wall and the Rishus Hayochid is going to be Potter. It's going to be Potter Aval Asr. As we know, the general rule in Shabbos is Kol B'Tur the Shabbos is Potter Aval Asr. Over here, it's also going to be Potter Aval Asr with Karmelis. We know the halacha that it's also to carry, but it's a Karmelis, not a Rishus Hayochid, which would pose problems and make it a Chiyuv Deraisa, as Rebbe Lezer said. Mishnah Gimel. Chatzar shenifritzel Rishus Harabim mishtei ruchayseh. The previous Mishnah concluded with the halacha that a chutzner whose wall collapsed, leaving it completely open to Rishus Harabim, is nidan kekarmelis. The Mishnah did not say whether it collapsed before Shabbos or on Shabbos, and whether this makes any nafkamina. Our Mishnah takes up this issue in connection with a different case in which a chutzner is considered to be nifratz. Chutzner shenifratzel Rishus Harabim mishnei ruchayseh. If there's a chutzner that was breached during Shabbos, such that it is now open to Rishus Harabim on two of its sides, that the collapse occurred along one of its corners, so that the two walls are now collapsed, and there's no longer a mechitza separating the chatzar from the Rishus Harabim. Similarly, if there's a house that was breached during Shabbos on two of its sides along one of its corners, similarly, if there's an alley whose beams or poles which serve to permit carrying in a mavoi were removed during Shabbos, it remains mutter to carry in all of these places for the duration of their Shabbos. Asur and Lasad Lava, but they're forbidden for future Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, as Isaac Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that whether it's mutter to carry in an enclosed place on Shabbos depends on what the conditions were when Shabbos began. Since the Chatzar, the Bayis, or the Mavoi had good mechitzas when Shabbos began, we may continue to carry in them throughout Shabbos, even though the mechitzas became no good, became puzzled during Shabbos. Obviously, this applies only if enough of the walls remained after the collapse to qualify the area as Rishus Hayochid Minat Torah. However, one may not carry in these places on the next Shabbos, because when that Shabbos begins, the area is not enclosed, and you would need to fix it in order for it to be a valid mechitza. Rabbi Yossi says that it can't be that an area can be considered properly enclosed for one Shabbos and not properly enclosed for other Shabbos. But he holds like this: Im mutarm l'aseh Shabbos, mutarm l'aseh lava. If im asurim l'aseh lava, asurim l'aseh Shabbos. If these places are permitted for the rest of that Shabbos, they must be permitted for future Shabbos as well. And if they're forbidden for future Shabbos, asurim l'aseh Shabbos, then they must be forbidden for the rest of that Shabbos as well. Since it's indeed forbidden to carry in these places on future Shabbos, it's also forbidden for the remainder of the Shabbos which the breach occurred. Meaning, as soon as this breach happens, this place becomes aser. It becomes aser from now on. Rabbi Yossi holds that when a mechitza separating Rishus Hayochid from a Karmelis or Rishus Harabim becomes puzzled during Shabbos, one may no longer carry in the Rishus Hayochid. However, if the mechitza is needed only to separate between two Rishus Hayochids that have no Eruv in them, as the case we mentioned in the Mishnah Beis, in which a Chatzar HaGodel was nifratz into a Chatzar HaKtana, Even Rabbi Yossi agrees that the two chatzeros remain mutter for the rest of that Shabbos. In that case, the loss of the wall didn't open the courtyards to the outside. It just created a situation in which their individual Eirovin were no longer good enough, and a joint Erev is now needed. Rabbi Yossi agrees that a change of Erev status does not affect the permission to carry for the rest of that Shabbos. So the Eirovin they made before Shabbos continue to be matir each Rosh Hashanah for the rest of that Shabbos. And Machlekes in this Mishnah applies to the case at the end of the previous Mishnah as well. It's very interesting. If you go through the Gemaras, there's Bechlal a question if you have an Erev that was there at the beginning of Shabbos but then got lost. If you have a Mechitza that started off at the beginning of Shabbos and then fell down. So this is going to be part of that question of how to deal with that. Mishnah Dalet. If someone builds an upper story on top of two houses that are on opposite sides of the Rishus Rabbim, so that the upper story now forms a roof over the Rishus Rabbim. So too, if there are bridges that cross over Rishus Rabbim, so that the road underneath the bridge is open on two opposite sides, while being enclosed on the other two sides by the walls holding up the bridge. Think about these big buildings that have a bridge that connects. That has a bridge that they could walk over the street. A lot of times you see it by hospitals. Maimonides Hospital has one, and over here in Waterbury Hospital has it also, I believe. So that's called a Gsharm Hamfulashim. So Mataltlum Tachteim b'Shabbos, you may carry underneath them the upper story or the bridge on Shabbos, because these places are now viewed as being surrounded by four walls. The two walls of the houses, or if the bridge supports on either side of the Rishus Rabbim, and the two walls that are formed by the sides of the overhead structure extending downward with Gurachis Mechitzta. Right? Or the Rav actually says, Tachas Ha'aliyah, Lefi Tikra, the Pi Tikra Mikan and Mikan Yerid V'Saisem. Metaltan Tachteim, B'Shabbos you may carry underneath them, B'Shabbos is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, that's Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to. The Chacham do not allow carrying in these places, because they hold that the sides of the sides of the structures of on top do not extend downwards to form walls in such a case. The Chachamim maintain that the halacha of the side of a roof extending downwards to create a wall does not work when it's necessary to enclose two open sides that are opposite each other. But if you have one wall, then the Chacham would be maskim l'chayra that he didn't pitik yered the seising, as it comes up here, as it comes up in Masech the Sukkah. V'odam Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda says further, we make an Erev, Shitufei Mavois, for an alley that's open at both ends, but has two full walls on other sides, provided that there's a polar beam, a lechi or a kaira, at both open sides. An Erev is such a Mavoi is sufficient, because two full walls alone form a Rishus Yochim and Atera. But the Chacham forbid carrying in this Mavoi, because they hold that two full walls do not form a private Rishus Minatera, and therefore the poles or beams on the open sides of the alley are insufficient. According to the Chachamim, at least three walls are needed to make Rishus Yochid, and a pole or a beam is matir an area for carrying only if it qualifies as Rishus Yochid Minatera, and if it's not, then it will not qualify to be a Rishus. Adkan.